want to welcome you to this book launch. The book is What Would Jesus Really Eat? A biblical case for eating meat.
We wish we could eat the meat, but
So good morning, and we're excited about having you here. This book was edited, and they were also contributors by two of our faculty at Palm Beach Atlantic University, one from the School of Communication and Media and one from the School of Ministry. Dr. Wes Jamison is Associate Professor of Public Relations, and Dr. Paul Copan is Professor and Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics in the School of Ministry. And we're excited that we have this time to just talk a little bit about this book. I find it really interesting. Before we get into it, Dr. Jamison, how long have you been teaching here at Palm Beach Atlantic?
11 years.
11 years. And Dr. Copan, I believe you're 15, correct?
Yeah.
So we've got some veterans here at the school of, at the university. Well, again, the book is What Would Jesus Really Eat? I think it's a very interesting title and topic. And so I want to just start off. You don't see a lot of books with the subtitle, The Biblical Case for Eating Meat. It's just interesting. You don't see that. So what led you to produce a book like this?
Basically, there is a concerted effort by opponents of American, for want of a better term, industrial agriculture, to try to cherry pick arguments, both secular and ecclesial, to oppose the animal agriculture. And so there's been a number of books, What Would Jesus Eat? And all of them basically are eisegeted. They begin from a premise that obviously meat eating is wrong, so they try to make the case that eating meat is wrong. And the animal rights movement, primarily Humane Society of the United States, has been working now for about 15 years with religious groups, giving them Bible studies, giving them materials to basically teach in church that eating meat from certain types of farms or eating meat itself is wrong. It's morally wrong. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to counter that. So this is an example of applied theology and also applied public relations, to basically say, for those of you who out there who may not know what it says, and for those who do, here's what the case actually is. Why the church in the New Testament age has always viewed the eating of meat as a legitimate activity independent of its source. So that's where it originated from, and then an actual group in Washington, I've got a number of grants from the USDA and other groups there, said, would you be interested to research this to see, is there a theological case to be made for the defense of meat eating from the Bible? And interestingly, it's a secular group that many of the board of trustees do not profess Christ in any way, but they realized, we're taking a hit on this topic. Would there be a way that you could address this in a way that was biblically accurate?
Great. Well, thank you. You have a lot of contributors to the book, and they come from such a diverse background. You've got two philosophers, public relations person, professor in communication and rhetoric, Old Testament scholar, a veterinarian, and a hog farmer. It sounds like a joke. They all went into a restaurant. Yeah, I was going to use the restaurant, not the bar.
Salad bar, though.
Salad bar, yes. So why such a diverse list of contributors? Where did you come up with this list that said we should have this person do it?
Well, Wes was the one who brought me into this conversation. He had already recruited Walter Kaiser, an Old Testament scholar, to speak on this topic. And then Tom St. Antoine, who is here and will speak later, he teaches rhetoric and here at PBA, and so he was also involved in this project. And Wes knew a couple of brothers who are hog farmers working in agriculture as well, and so he recruited them, Christians who had been in generational hog farming from I guess a Dutch background, the Spronk brothers, and then we had someone I know, Timothy Shao, who's a philosopher and has done work in this area. Recruited him to write a couple of chapters on why humans are distinct from animals and why it's morally permissible to eat meat. And so bringing together a number of people from different disciplines, different areas of expertise, that really led to a wonderful cross-fertilization, a wonderful complementarity on these various themes, looking at them from different angles rather than just looking at it from a philosophical angle or a theological angle or rhetorical angle and so forth.
Yeah, I think for such a short book, really, the argument itself, to have that diversity is makes the book a very enjoyable book in that sense.
One thing I'd add is, for instance, like with the veterinarian and the hog farmer, I know them both, and they're both Calvin college grads, and they're both very philosophically oriented. They very much have a Kuyperian worldview, and the hog farmer is not just a hog farmer. He was president of the National Pork Board,
Okay.
which is the largest entity of its kind in the world, and he's very thoughtful about this, and he's been asking me questions for 15 or 20 years. He's thought about this in depth, even though he's just a pig farmer.
Yeah.
And in that Dutch Kuyperian tradition, they spend a lot of time around the dinner table talking about philosophy. I thought he would be a really good one, other than just the basic premise of the book was, why do words matter? How you talk about this, that was Tom. Why does this debate matter? Then why does the Old Testament matter, the New Testament matter? What about ethics? And then finally, what about someone who actually farms animals and does so with a clear conscience?
Yeah.
And that was sort of the structure of the book.
Great. Well, Dr. Jamison, can you tell us a little bit of your story? Because this book really started from your story and how you came involved in this topic beyond just the purpose, but what's a little bit of your story in connection to even the industry of farming?
My undergraduate degree, don't ask me why, was in agriculture.
Okay.
But I ended up going back to graduate school, and my topic of my dissertation was, this is 30 years ago, was agricultural politics. And one of the chapters of my dissertation, which led to a journal article, was on the use of religion beginning in the mid-1980s by the animal rights movement. I studied mass movement psychology. The use of religion by the animal rights movement to mobilize people using moralistic arguments and ecclesial arguments behind their cause. So I've been interested in it, and then over a number of years I've done some writing on it and done some thinking about it, and then I was an elder in a church and an interim pastor for a while, and so I have a lot, because of my academic background, I have a lot of contacts in Washington who would actually ask, Wes, you may know about this. What is this thing? And that eventually led to my background both in agriculture, agricultural politics, to is there a way to make this applied, to take a look at how the use of rhetoric and persuasion in misquoting or cherry picking, proof texting the Bible is or isn't being working. And Paul and I developed a relationship over time in talking about this idea of applied theology or theology and ethics and service to a cause. And then Tom and I have done a number of research projects on this, on the use of rhetoric, and that's how it came about. And there was sort of an intersection of my interests about the use of words and persuasion, and then Washington, D.C. groups saying, we don't understand anything about this, could you help us?
Yeah. Well, wonderful, wonderful. Which leads a great segue. I'm going to ask Dr. San Antoine to come take my chair just for a second here. Yeah. Since we have the privilege of having him here. Dr. San Antoine wrote two chapters, the first two chapters of this book, and actually provides, these chapters provide, there you go, perfect, provide the backdrop for the whole conversation is the use of language or words in the process. And if you're like me, you're not as aware of these terms. You're like, I don't know what this means. Like, what does really animal welfare actually mean? How can we understand that? And there are a couple terms I thought maybe you could help us understand a little bit more. And so that's the first term is animal welfare, dominion / stewardship, and then finally nature or creation. And how you see these terms being used in rhetoric to persuade people one way or the other on this topic.
Sure. So thank you all for including me, and it was a great project, and it was really an honor to be part of it. I've done, as a rhetorician, most of my work is in rhetoric of place, rhetoric of space. So I've done a lot with the role that the agrarian myth has played in forming the sort of American culture, American spirit, and so on. Contrasts between urban and rural and those kinds of things. So my chapters are essentially a sort of a survey of the culture, right? We're not just coming into this argument ex nihilo. This is an ongoing argument. We all probably know people who spend more time talking about food than anything else. what I ate yesterday, what I'm going to eat tomorrow, what's good for me, what's bad for me, what we should eat, what we shouldn't be eating, how to fix this, I just know lots of people where I'll sit back sometimes and think, all you ever talk about is food. And so it's really culturally I think a passion, an obsession almost in our culture. What we're eating, what we should eat, and then there are lots of sort of organized groups, right? So of course the Humane Society. We can't not have seen movies like Babe about the lovable pig that we should. I don't know what. Not even. So, taking that approach of let's see what the arguments are, and let's take them seriously, right? Because those arguments are formidable ones. There are some interesting arguments that we need to pay attention to. So, right, essentially the framework is let's define our terms before we start an argument in the best sort of Platonic sense of things. Let's figure out what our terms. Let's define our terms before we can advance an argument and move forward. So we talk about things like animal welfare, dominion, stewardship, nature, creation. Right? These are contested terms, and different groups are going to define them differently. Animal welfare, right? It's one of those sort of you sort of benefit from strategic ambiguity. As soon as you carefully define what it is, your coalition gets smaller and smaller and smaller. If you just say, I'm in favor of cute animals, everybody's on my team. But then as we carefully define what are our duties toward these animals, what is the nature of creation that God has gifted with us, and so on, the more carefully we sort of define these things, the more we splinter off into different groups and the conflict arises. So that was sort of the purpose of the chapter. It was sort of a place to start, right? Before we can go more in depth with subsequent chapters, and before we can move on with our arguments, let's not necessarily just define our terms, but let's figure out what are the key terms and what are the choices. Right? What are the different ways of defining these terms that are already out there, already in the marketplace, so to speak.
Great. Thank you. The next step in the process of the argument for the book is moving into kind of more theological, a little bit more theological focus. So here are the terms, and here's the language that's being used. So let's turn to doctrine. And Dr. Jamison, in your chapters, you talk about 3 Christian doctrines that really play a role in this debate. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what those doctrines are, and then how do they play a role? What role do they play in the argument?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Really spanning back 30 years and spanning back about 30 years and tracing this, you see a reverting to, a usage of, and a segmentation of these terms among all sides. And those terms would be dominion. The term of dominion, what does it mean? What does it imply? What did it imply for the original Hebrews? What's it imply for us today? So the dominion, the idea that we're given dominion, radah, over the animals. The imago Dei, humans are exceptional. We are unique, although part of creation, we are also unique in it. That although animals, we are not one of the animals. We actually have not only responsibilities, we have privileges, being made in the image of God, and finally divine permission. We're not only given permission to eat animals, we're commanded to some extent. Jesus was an exceptionally gifted Jew. He kept the law, and that meant killing lambs at the Passover. The sacrificial system, again and again and again, both Old Testament, New Testament motif, shows that divine permission, or even fiat, to kill animals. Those seem to be the terms that have been the most contested over the last 30 years, up to and including Matthew Scully's book, Dominion, that was published 10 years ago, which took the term, emptied it of its classical Christian meaning, and then put his meaning back into it, that because we have dominion, we are obligated to care for the animals in what would be basically an animal-centric way. That their best interests are, because we have dominion, we are to be almost like zookeepers and put their best interests first. So those were the doctrines that, and the reason I chose those seem to be the ones that when you do a content analysis, Tom and I have done content analysis on this, those are the ones that seem to be contested. I do a lot of speaking at meetings, and the farmers every time, we got dominion. God gave us the right. And the other side, being very astute, took those terms, flipped them, and the audience of farmers don't know how to respond. So that's why those three, and they seem to be relatively important doctrines in the Bible for animal usage.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Now, there are two chapters that focus on the debate from a more philosophical perspective. Central to that discussion is the idea of moral stance. Do animals have moral stance? And then the contributor talks about this issue of pain in relationship to moral stance. Dr. Copan, could you explain a little bit for us who might not know? I think most of us would go, I'm not really sure if I understand moral stance. And then also the question, do animals have moral stance, and why or why not?
Yeah, the contributor on the status or the position of animals is written by philosopher Timothy Shao, and he has done done two chapters, one on human exceptionalism, the other one on why it's morally permissible to eat animals. And he begins by talking about how human beings are indeed, in their capacities, distinct from the rest of the animals in terms of rationality, agency, the ability to make moral decisions, the fact that human beings have duties which animals do not have. It's interesting that Wes was telling me about how he did this survey when he was back in Iowa, noting that just asking people, are animals moral beings, and so forth, and they would say yes, they are, many of them. And then the question was, well, can animals ever do anything wrong? No, they can never do anything wrong. So there is this assumption that animals have a moral status, but there's no moral duty, no moral capacity at all that these animals have. And so again, so that is a big feature. Human beings have capacities. Even the unborn. Some people say, well, look, an animal that like a monkey or whatever is able to do a lot more than, say, an unborn child. So can't we compare in terms of function and assign a greater value to a monkey or something like that? The problem is, here we are, monkeys don't have moral capacities. All human beings do, even if those capacities aren't realized. We have a certain nature, a moral nature that, again, given enough time for the unborn to realize these capacities, to exert the will, to reflect rationally, to exert one's own agency and so forth. This is part of what it means to be made in the image of God, that the image of God is not diminished by the fact that a child is still in the womb or something like that. So again, there is something that is distinct about human beings that makes us what we are, that animals do not have. And again, what you will see in the literature like PETA, Lois Newkirk, the founder of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, not the People Eating Tasty Animals parody organization, but Ingrid Newkirk said a rat is a pig, as a boy is a dog. Fundamentally trying to make everything equal, but ultimately diminishing the capacity, the status, the standing of human beings. When it comes to animal pain, some people say, well, how can you inflict pain on these sentient creatures? Well, the question is, I think a lot of people assume that pain by itself tells us something about moral status or standing. Does consciousness, what about that? Why couldn't consciousness contribute to our understanding of, to give maybe a moral status? There are, bugs are conscious. And so forth, but but it's part of a larger package. Animals cannot enter into suffering. They may experience pain, and it enhances survival, reproduction, and so forth. But human beings have the capacity to think about their pain, to think about the meaning of life and how pain fits in, and how to endure this pain and experience suffering and so forth. So there's, again, because of our status as human beings, we're able to reflect on these things, that we're not merely, like when we think about sometimes people say, oh, this horse is suffering, we ought to put it down because it can't understand. Well, we say that's humane. Well, okay, that may be humane, but it's not human. We wouldn't do that to a human being in that same kind of position. Why? Because human beings are made in the image of God. These animals are not. We just have come with these different capacities. So those are a few things that we talk about in this. Maybe let's just say one quick thing. And Wes pointed this out to me when we began our whole discussion, is that this linchpin in our whole conversation is often pets, how pets in our society have this place of privilege within the home, that they're like honorary members of the family. And and some people from PETA or other groups will say, well, if you can't eat Lassie, then you shouldn't be eating cattle or chickens or pigs. And so they're fundamentally turning this, making this this equivalency. And the problem with that, of course, is, well, one, this is kind of a cultural thing. I mean, we'll eat meat, but we're not going to eat rats or certain things that we find distasteful and so forth. But in places like China or elsewhere, they will gladly eat cats and dogs and so forth in some places. So it's more a matter of cultural preference than it is fundamentally a matter of animal rights. Which again, animals do not have rights, but human beings do have a stewardship to not to inflict unnecessary pain or whatever. But again, just because we have a stewardship doesn't mean that animals have some sort of intrinsic rights as moral beings. Anyway, just a few thoughts.
Wes, you want to
I
say
have one thing. Who in here knows of somebody, I'll do it hypothetical so you don't have to out yourself. Who in here knows somebody that owns a pet that functions like a member of the family? Views it as a member of the family. Those same people, raise your hands. Do you eat meat? You are a hypocrite of the highest order because you extend moral status to an animal as a companion and deny it to an animal as cuisine. That cognitive dissonance is the sweet spot for the animal rights movement that points out you extend moral status in one area but not in another, and they use very sophisticated persuasive techniques, including ecclesial arguments targeting religious people, basically saying, do you see your hypocrisy now? You either have to give up your pet or give up eating meat. And that's basically the essence of their use of ecclesiology or scripture.
What about eating your pet?
Can I tell you one anecdote? Our children asked, could they own pets? And I think Tom knows this. We told them under one condition, they'd be willing to kill them and eat them. All four of our children had to agree that if they had a pet, that they'd be willing to view it from a utilitarian instrumentalist view, and that if necessary, they would kill and eat the pet. So the answer for that one is, I'm completely in favor of it as long as it's stir-fried.
All right. So let me ask you, we're going to get to two last things, and then we're going to open it up for questions. All right? So I think there's some Christians that believe that how we raise animals, how they're killed, how they're processed is cruel. And that eating meat is basically using the concept of dominion as a license to do whatever you want to do to animals with no accountability. All right? So I think there's this kind of perception that there are Christians that have this. How would you respond to them in a realizing they're a brother or sister in Christ? How would you respond to them that it's okay for you to eat meat?
I think I would take first of all, probably compassionately, in a Romans 14 sense, that if your conscience is weak, I may not say this, but if your convictions are that you should not eat meat, don't do it. Obey your conscience. But you don't want to project your convictions on the others as commandments because, for instance, one of the things I learned in this project, studying Old Testament history, the Jews sacrificed approximately 1,800,000 animals a year for the temple sacrifice. The rabbis would stand in between knee-deep and hip-deep blood as they sacrifice the animals. Jewish kill prohibits anesthesia. You cannot anesthetize the animal when you kill it. It prohibits anesthesia. And so that's commanded. And the motif is that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. That's an Old Testament motif. So I would take them to the Old Testament and say, okay, so in the Jewish mindset, animal death de facto, a priori, is not bad. Then I'd point out to them that you are projecting your 21st century postmodern sensibilities about animals onto a process in which there's no historical evidence that the confinement of animals was wrong. In fact, the Jews, we know, confined animals to raise them for the temple sacrifice. So animal confinement in and of itself is not wrong. Animal processing is more humane than it's ever been. Jews and halal kill, so Muslim kill, prohibits anesthesia. All animals in the United States are required by law to be anesthetized. I would try to take them through that, but what I've learned about this one, this is a moral debate, not a scientific debate. It's not even based upon sort of a rationality of competing fact claims. So you just sort of point out, as I have to Christine, who you've referenced in this, you need to follow your convictions.
Yeah.
If you're convicted that this is wrong, follow your convictions, but don't project those onto others whose convictions are not the same.
And it might be helpful to add too that, given the fact that 2% of all Americans live on farms, the rest are living in suburbs or urban settings where we're so far removed from what used to be a daily occurrence. You'd go to the backyard or to the barn and you'd get dinner for that evening. You'd slaughter the animal. And so we're so far removed from that now that it seems like, oh, that's a terrible thing. How could you do that? Well, this just used to be part of how we have lived. And for many people throughout the world, this is how they continue to live. And so the fact that we're so removed from it, I think has blunted our own moral distinctions between humans and animals. In fact, more and more people in the rising generation, they would rather, if their pet were drowning and a stranger, human being, were drowning, they would go for their pet rather than the human stranger. This is, so we're kind of having this softening of our own moral awareness, our own moral categories. And so that's a very troubling thing that we're also seeing. So that's another factor to bring into this. I don't know, Tom, if you wanted to offer any comments along these lines.
Yeah, I read about narrative a little bit in the second chapter, and every plate of food has a story that goes with it, right? Real or imagined, there's a story of how that food was produced, how it was processed, how it was brought to that place, how it was prepared, how it's attached, a representative of the place. When you're in this city, you got to eat their barbecue. When you're in New Orleans, you got to try the gumbo. There's so much narrative, sort of construction that goes around, all of our conceptions of food and the relationship between food and place and food and culture and so on. So it all gets sort of wrapped into those constructions as well.
One last term I'll use is confinement. Basically, we all know the story of the shepherd and the sheepfold. You confine animals for a reason. That's because living in nature sucks. And so, but this isn't really about the actual, what I would call the empirical evidence. This is more about the projection of an aesthetic value. The evidence shows very clearly that free-range chickens are under more health stressors and under more psychological stressors because they're being preyed upon than are those in confinement. That the very same consumer that will keep a cockatoo in a cage will be aesthetically offended by a chicken in a cage for aesthetic reasons, even though by all physiological measures, the chicken in the cage is better off. So you're dealing with an awful lot of overlays, as both Paul and Tom have talked about, these overlays of meaning, culture, the disintegration of barriers between humanity and the rest of creation. It's a very complex issue, and the book tries to peel it apart.
Well, wonderful. I think what we're going to do now is open it up to any questions that you might have for our three panelists, contributors to this book.
Is there a chapter or any contribution on the health benefits of going one way or the other in your book?
Well, I do touch on that and make reference to it, that there are, in kind of footnoting it, that there are some benefits that you will get a lot more from meat, say amino acids and so forth, than rather than just trying to get it on a plant-based diet. That there are some things that are just, I think having a balance. Not as we're not advocating you have to eat meat all the time, although there are some diets that do advocate that. But we're basically saying that there is a balance, and also it comes out too in the book in various chapters that it's just a very inexpensive way of feeding a lot of people. in say urban settings. It might be nice to have a Wendell Berry sort of story where your pig is roaming free and then you can kill it later on because it's had a good life and so forth. Well, people in Singapore or Hong Kong aren't going to be able to do that sort of a thing. There's a high population density and having access to animals, yes, in factory farms and so forth, but yet it provides a lot of nutrition, a lot of health benefits to a lot of people that, again, it would be a lot more expensive, a lot more difficult to get, say, in a plant-based diet.
And I'll answer it this way, that's a digression we didn't want to get into at depth. We wanted to sort of limit it to, from historical and textual evidence, can you eat meat and the source of it. As you can imagine, there's a lot of contested information out there about the benefits or lack thereof of eating meat. I tell people, look, it's a nutrient-dense protein pack. It is a complete pack. You should have no more than 8 ounces a day. You don't require that. Your body doesn't need it. It's your ethical choice. The other thing I tell them is animals take creation we can't eat and drink and convert it into creation we can. We cannot drink the water a pig drinks, a chicken drinks, or a cow drinks and not get sick. We cannot eat what they eat. So God gave us a mechanism in a fallen world whereby animals convert marginal products and photosynthesis basically into tissue. They're like walking nutrient banks. So if you're in a marginal land, sub-Saharan Africa, you're not going to grow vegetables. But you can keep animals that will convert, it's a nutrient bank, that will convert grass, ruminants, into things like milk and tissue you can use. So there's a historical antecedent to this debate. Why does agriculture exist? Because animals are useful. And that gets lost. But if, obviously a vegetarian diet can be beneficial. You have to balance the amino acids pretty tightly. You have to pay attention to what you eat, and it's rather rigorous, as all asceticism is, but you can get there.
Great, thank you. Another question. Ben.
All right, so this is somewhat, thank you, my name is Ben Devana. I'm a meat eater as well. Thank you for this book. I look forward to reading it. Haven't had a chance yet, but look very much forward to it. And somewhat new to the debate, but had a few, try to keep the thoughts short and then get your thoughts. One of them is so as Christians, we are constantly trying to live into the kingdom of God. Now, when I read, I also like to think about the new heavens and the new earth. We have the image of the lion lays down with the lamb, this sort of thing. We also have Jesus, after the risen Jesus, when he appears, he eats broiled fish, so he does eat fish. But I wonder if it might, and what your challenge would be to the idea that it would be considered an ideal to be either vegetarian, sort of soy milk, not solid food, for those in the kingdom, that there are times when we have to eat animals due to circumstances, but that the ideal would be the lion and the lamb and the risen Jesus only eating fish, or I guess that would be an argument from silence. He might have had more, but what do you see in regard to that, in terms of thinking ahead?
Right. Yeah. In my chapter, I do spend I do spend time talking about these things. One, a lot of people will appeal to Genesis 1 that there is this plant-based diet, and I'd say ultimately yes, we're all eating a plant-based diet, as Wes was talking about. But we also, but when you're having dominion over the fish of the sea, what does that mean? It sounds like there's an edibility factor here that's part of that. Secondly, we read in texts like the latter chapters of Job and also Psalm 104, which is a creation psalm, where God is the one who has created the food chain, has made animals to be predatory, to benefit from this food chain, and it says that this is good. God opens his hand for all of his creatures, and this is good. The same word used in Genesis chapter 1. Paul himself, who's following a new creation ethic in 1 Timothy 4, says he speaks against those who are actually teaching heresy, doctrines of demons, when they forbid, again, sexual relations within marriage, and also the eating of certain foods like meat. That this is something that Paul said, no, these are to be received with gratitude. And also, speaking of the lion with the lamb, we have to be careful about some of these poetic instances in, say, the book of Isaiah, where you have the lion with the lamb. We also see in Isaiah 35 that in the new heavens and the new earth, there will be no lion there. And what does Paul mean? What does Isaiah mean? Well, that there's not going to be any sort of danger. And if the animals, these carnivores are eating straw, it's a sign that they're domesticated, that all danger has been removed. Also in Isaiah 25, in the new heavens and the new earth, when the shroud of death is removed, there will be feasting, and it uses the language of eating meat, of eating marrow, rich marrow and wine, aged wine and so forth. So which text are you going to pick? No lion, lying with the lamb, eating rich meats and so forth. So again, we have to be very careful about cherry picking. I'd say, if you wanted to advance the new creation ethic, well, since we're not going to be married the new heavens and the new earth, why marry now then? Let's live into this future ethic.
One observation that plays in what Paul said and what Tom has examined. This debate is about presuppositions. And once you examine the presuppositions, you understand the outpouring. Eschatology matters, and there's a weird form of secularized post-millenarian or millenarianism out there that the Humane Society's picked up on, and they co-opt that language that would, for a person who's on-mill or post-mill, would be very familiar. But they fill it back in that you can actually usher in in fact, there's an entire theme of thought they send out to churches. You can actually bring in the peaceable kingdom by your food choices. That by choosing to be vegetarian, you can bring in the peaceable kingdom. However, the research shows clearly that it is a carnage of animals in vegetarian farms. The combine chops up mice and voles. The amount of animal carnage on a vegetarian farm is extreme. Insects are killed, animals are killed because you have to keep the deer away from your corn. So long story short, the Jainists have tried this, and it doesn't work very well. Animals are going to die. It's just a matter of how much your conscience can afford that. So that's just to kind of place that in the framework of the debate.
Good. Don.
Hi. I love meat and I like to eat it. But my question is in regards to with what a lot of researchers are arguing about climate change. I was wondering if the book touches on that at all, about how many argue that cows are a big contributor to climate change.
It doesn't cover it because that's another contested argument, not for a book on what the Bible says about meat. You've triggered me now.
Now, for volume 2, we've got diets, and volume 3, climate control.
The basic overview is that you don't have to worry direct climate change from monogastric animals like pigs and chickens. The big debate would be methane producing animals like ruminants like cows. I would refer to you Frank Metlaner at University of California, who's done an enormous study on this. The methane production by ruminant animals is a different type of methane that is carbon sequestered far easier than the methane of the car you produce driving here. So although it's a contributor, it's a very minor, the volume is large, but it's sequestered in a carbon sense, carbon sequestration, and removed from the environment very easily. Otherwise, you would have had climate change. Do you know there were more ruminants in North America 400 years ago than there are today? Bison herds were enormous. So methane emissions from bovine species, ruminants, they're real, they can cause an impact, but the environmental degradation of that is far more efficient than it would be from a jet airliner or internal combustion engine. It's real, it's a real issue. But it's a carbon sequestration issue. And he has a great, you can go on his website, Frank Metlaner at University of California has a great kind of PowerPoint presentation you can download, and he's by no means an apologist for industry. He'll show you, yeah, here's how much is being produced, here much is sequestered through carbon sequestration with grass, here's what the car produces. It's a nice graphic for you. But to answer your question, think about that debate. Next thing you know, we have Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity yelling at us about our claims on climate change in the Bible.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to say thank you to our guests, and we're very thankful. You can applaud this. Again, the book is What Would Jesus Really Eat? The Biblical Case for Eating Meat. And on behalf of the School of Ministry, I want to thank you for attending, for watching on Facebook. And as we look ahead over the next few months, I want you to be aware of a few things. We're hoping to be launching a podcast out of the School of Ministry with faculty. We might have a round 2 of this in a podcast with faculty and guest lecturers, just to encourage you along the way as you think deeply about God, about our world, and about our mission that He has given us. And then also, mark your calendars. I know it's way in advance, but mark your calendars for Thursday, February 13th for the Jess Moody Faith and Culture Forum. And we'll be looking at the issue. The theme for that is a dialogue on racism, looking back and looking forward. And so we want you to be aware of that. Well, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this at this time, but I'm hungry. I really could use some good barbecue. But thanks again for joining us. And if you would like to pick up a book, Susan is available, $10 for a book. We're subsidizing it, and you can get the contributors. We got 3. You can even get a third bonus if you act now. You get the third bonus signature. So thank you again for showing up.